What are they booing about? I don't know. Well, welcome to the Mindful Cranks, where using your mind is not necessarily a bad thing, and where being cranky can actually be mindful. Let's crank it up. So I spoke with Daniel Nehring, who is an Associate Professor of Sociology at East China University of Science and Technology in Shanghai, China. Daniel is, in my opinion, an ascending and a prolific scholar in the field of critical sociology, an amazing networker who has brought together a diverse group of international collaborators from multiple disciplines who are doing cutting-edge research on therapeutic cultures around the globe. Our conversation explores how therapeutic discourses have not only penetrated a range of institutional regimes, but also how such discourses have a global reach with even mass consumption now in China. We talk about the rise of the self-help entrepreneur and how such figures such as Jon Kabat-Zinn utilized various rhetorical and discursive strategies to bolster his narrative authority and commercial success. We also talk about the relevance and importance of Wright Mills and his classic work, The Sociological Imagination, contrasting that to what Daniel calls the psychological imagination, which has informed the self-help genre and the mindfulness literature. We focus on an article he recently published this year with Ashley Frawley in the journal Sociology of Health and Illness. Our mutual admiration of Wright Mills is evident in that we both share in the view that academics have become beholden to a bureaucratic ethos and the stranglehold of a neoliberal audit culture, and that academics need to wake up, speak up, and become actively engaged as public intellectuals. I think you'll really enjoy this episode. Well, I'd like to welcome a special guest today, Daniel Nehring, who is at the International School of Social Work in East China University of Science and Technology, coming up from us all the way from Shanghai, China. So thank you, Daniel, for agreeing to be interviewed for the Mindful Cranks.
Thank you very much for having me. Very pleased to be doing this.
Well, I came across Daniel's work a couple of years ago when a friend of mine who's also been on the podcast, Stephen Stanley from Cardiff, told me about the network that you created. This was a worldwide network that I believe focuses on therapeutic culture, if I'm correct, and you created that with some other colleagues like Edgar Cabanas, Ole Jacob Mattsson from the University of Oslo, and several others. And that's how I first kind of became aware of the work that you were doing. But you've been really prolific the past, 4 or 5 years as a scholar in this area. And can you tell us a little bit about this network? Because one of the things about your work that I think we'll really get into later is just not only how collaborative it is, but just how international it is.
Yeah, so this network is called Popular Psychology, Self-Help Culture, and the Happiness Industry, and that started really in late 2016. At the time, together with a group of colleagues, I published a book that looked at therapeutic culture from a transnational perspective, which we thought, well, and I still think is a relatively rare perspective in this field of study. Some important work on transnational connections in therapeutic culture more recently notwithstanding. And in response to that, that work, Edgar Cabanas, who's based in Madrid, contacted me, and I hadn't come across Edgar's work before, and we started talking, and we noted how much we had in common, but how much we'd also been working on the same topics quite separately, and that made us realize that we work in a multidisciplinary field of research that's really a little bit dispersed, perhaps a little bit too dispersed. So the objective of this network has been to bring together people from different disciplines across the social sciences and humanities, and based in different parts of the world, who all share an interest in this subject matter, very broadly conceived. And that's what we've been doing, and quite a number of activities have come out of this. We've launched a book series which we are editing for Routledge that's titled Therapeutic Cultures. Quite a few books there published already, and quite a few more books under contract recently. Our Handbook of Global Therapeutic Cultures, which brings together 40 scholars from around the world who've all got an interest in therapeutic cultures to look at this subject matter. That was published in late August. A number of networking activities, just planning a conference on transnational therapeutic cultures with a group of colleagues in Latin America. And this network has been quite productive in facilitating the kind of communication and exchange that we've been looking for. So that's what that is about.
Yeah, very good. I've been meaning to try to talk to Edgar Cabanas as well, because I really like the book he did with Eva Illouz called Manufacturing Happy Citizens. And another thing about your work is I think it's one of the most unique perspectives in terms of also including the voices of the global South, because many of the academic work, many of the academic articles and books and journals have been focused mostly as kind of a Anglo-European, North American, UK sort of focus. So I think that you bring in a really kind of alternative, complementary perspective by collaborating with people that can bring in different perspectives from the global South. We'll touch on that later, perhaps. I'd like to start out by talking about your research on therapeutic cultures. But before we dive into that, I think it might be helpful to provide maybe some general, broad context for listeners who may not be familiar with that term, therapeutic cultures, and help to define what you mean by that. So in a broad sense, what do you mean by therapeutic cultures, and how would you describe that, just in a general sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in a very general sense, for someone who's new to that subject matter, I guess there are several things that could be said. I guess we could say that the term therapeutic culture refers to the way in which psychotherapeutic knowledge, psychological knowledge, which is really, to begin with, academic and clinical, acquires currency in everyday life. The success of this knowledge and its practitioners in promoting their understanding of social life, human interaction, the social self as something that's accessible and meaningful to non-specialists across a range of institutional settings in everyday life, something that informs the way in which you and me and increasingly everybody think about who we are, how we feel, how we should engage with others, how we should lead our lives. So that's, I guess, one way of looking at it. And another side, which I've also been very interested in with regard to therapeutic culture, is again this transnational side. And there I'm interested in the ways in which forms of knowledge that, if one looks at their origins, have really been quite localized. Say academic Western psychology, say, for example, also mindfulness, come to be appropriated in diverse settings, circulate transnationally, and again become accessible to very broad groups of people. So there are kind of quite a range of processes of cultural appropriation, also of commercialization and commodification at work there, in which I've been interested in recent years. So I guess those are the two perspectives which come to mind in response to those questions. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, that's very clear. I know there's kind of a history to this, too. You definitely extrapolate on the history quite deeply in some of your writings, going back to kind of the classic work of Philip Reif, for example. And Eva Illouz, who I really admire her work. She, talks about, if I recall from her work, that something must be going on if so many people are attracted to these self-help techniques, and I think she refers to it as the triumph, right, of therapeutic cultures. But I think that this penetration of the psychological in our culture has gone beyond just the U.S. and the U.K. now, right? I mean, it's from your research, I was just stunned to learn a lot about what was going on in China from reading some of your chapters and stuff. I'm kind of jumping the gun here, but we might as well dive into what are you seeing from that side of the globe in terms of how this has penetrated even in countries such as China?
Well, I think if we talk about China, there are several processes that are at work here. China, for various historical reasons, was very closed until the 1970s, 1980s, then opened itself up to the outside world quite rapidly and quite suddenly, which brought with it, particularly in China's bigger cities, such as very notably Shanghai, where I am right now, a lot of cultural influences, products, consumer goods from the outside, which very rapidly have become very popular, and it also brought with it very large-scale socioeconomic and cultural transformations of society, which in China are often framed as a moral crisis. So the argument in China goes that the country is undergoing a moral crisis, that traditional values have to a large extent been lost, and that under a very competitive capitalist system, what's the paramount pursuit for people is to make money. That's the stereotypical argument. And in response to concerns about this, the government is very heavily invested in promoting social cohesion. So if I step outside my flat here, I'll come across very quickly propaganda posters that ask people to be wenming, that ask people to be civilized in their conduct towards each other. And if I ventured a bit further and stepped into a bookshop, I'd come across a whole load of self-help books for example. That's one manifestation among many others, such as the rise of psychotherapy, for example, for affluent people, TV talk shows with therapeutic content, all sorts of related materials on the internet of a keen interest which people have developed in drawing on psychotherapeutic discourses and certain philosophical discourses to make sense of their lives, to engage with the ethics of everyday life, and to achieve some sort of, self-improvement. So to go back to the example of self-help books that I would find if I stepped into a bookshop here, what I would find would be, on the one hand, a lot of translated Western stuff, classical Dale Carnegie, how to win friends and influence people, how to become rich, how to become a successful business person, and so on and so forth. But also a lot of much more localized material that draws on other kinds of sources. For example, there's a very important strand of Confucian self-help that's promoted by Confucianism, and public speakers, public intellectuals have been very active in promoting a kind of strand of Confucian thought that they're trying to make publicly accessible, relevant, and interesting to people today. And the government, as I said, also very heavily invested these efforts under the labels of social cohesion and social harmony. So that's what has made China, as we wrote in our 2016 book, the biggest consumer of popular psychology worldwide in a very short span of time.
That's really interesting. Yeah. It sounds like then that this whole trend towards therapeutic cultures has extended its reach. It's become kind of a global phenomena then. And I like also how you point out, I can't remember, there's so many chapters that in books that you sent me, but somewhere along the line you said that you saw that you could trace this back even to 19th century colonialism in terms of kind of the rhetoric of universalizing and the biological reductionist narratives that were going on even at that time, that there were like psychological explanations of dissent, right? Sort of the subjugation of the racial other. So that's really interesting how governments have become really quite interested in the therapeutic. I find that really, really interesting and somewhat scary in some ways.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah. Let's move on, because you talked about self-help, and I think there's more we could touch on, because you've spent a great deal of time surveying and studying self-help books. I think one of your books is based on 8 years of field work and studying more than 100 self-help books. And I said, you must have the patience of a saint to go through 100 self-help books. And because we've all heard of this genre, but I found it really quite fascinating just how similar the popular evangelical pastor Joel Osteen here in the U.S., how similar his advice is in comparison to Jon Kabat-Zinn, the so-called father of mindfulness. This whole kind of internal scrutiny of negative thoughts and techniques for self-monitoring and self-control. But I think you make a point that goes a lot further than this in your work, which is that these techniques promise not just ability to have better self-control, but that somehow they transmit behavioral norms into our culture. Can you just say a little bit about that?
Yeah. There is very obviously a moral component to popular psychology, to self-help. I think so. Self-help on its own, popular psychology on its own, may constitute such norms and values. I think mindfulness is a good example. The work that Jon Kabat-Zinn has done is a good example, in the sense that mindfulness in the West was, as far as I could trace this, not well known, not a major cultural influence until relatively recently. So the whole set of discourses and norms, values, and beliefs that have come to surround mindfulness in its Western popularized form are relatively new, and the activities of what I like to call self-help entrepreneurs have been constitutive of all that. On the other hand, popular psychology also plugs into pre-existing sets of norms, values, and beliefs, and repackages those to try and make them accessible. And, well, may make me sound somewhat cynical, sell them to certain groups of people. And there I would think, for example, about Joel Osteen, who speaks to a very specific group of people with certain Christian religious beliefs, mainly in the USA, even though his work radiates further, for example, into the Caribbean or into Latin America. And I think what Osteen does is to take a set of very well established American values, if you would like to say it so, frame them from a slightly religious angle in a way that's that would be acceptable to a very broad audience of readers. He writes in a way that's very decontextualized, so that you don't have to be in one place or another in the US. You don't even have to be in the US to understand what he's talking about. And then, well, sell this, make money, gain popularity, and so forth. Again, this sounds a little bit cynical, but the reason why I mention this is because popular psychology is about a very specific way in which its proponents, be it Jon Kabat-Zinn, be it Joel Osteen, be it any other kind of therapist or religious or spiritual figure, insert themselves into the public sphere. I think that the commercial side is very important to this mode of public insertion, and I think that affects a lot the way in which those narratives take shape and become influential in public life. I think a lot there about the contrast between self-help entrepreneurs and public intellectuals.
Yeah, we're going to get into that. I can't keep up with all these evangelical preachers out there in the U.S., but is Joel Osteen, do you know if he's the guy who asked his congregation to buy him a private jet, or was that somebody else? I don't know.
I think it was him. I'm pretty sure it was him. I don't remember now. I'm pretty sure it was him.
Yeah, I was reading another chapter by, is it Ole Matson? I don't know how to pronounce it. And he made a really important point. He was drawing from Christopher Lasch, who's another kind of classic critic of, well, back then it was called the me generation, right? The culture of narcissism and everything. But he made a really good point. He said that mental health or well-being has become, this is kind of a paraphrase, but mental health or well-being has become the secularized replacement for salvation in society. And that this therapeutic outlook has banished religion, and now it threatens to banish politics. I thought that was really a profound statement in terms of seeing the much deeper underlying sort of ramifications or implications of this particular kind of therapeutic outlook. Maybe we'll get into that a little bit more. But I think it's a good way to segue into, because you talked about just the commercial side of this and how important that is, and you actually came up with this notion of the self-help entrepreneur or the self-help entrepreneurship, and I agree with you completely. So do you want to say a little bit more? What is self-help entrepreneurship? How does it fit into this whole idea of therapeutic cultures? Maybe that's a good point to start off from.
Yeah, I'll explain that by way of an example. So the first time I became interested actually in the subject matter, that was long ago, that was in the late 1990s, just as I was starting to go to university at the time. I spent a lot of time in Mexico. I'm from Germany originally, but I'd gone on a school exchange, made many friends in Mexico, started to spend a lot of time there. And then I remember I had this a few friends who went to this private university, one of the largest private universities, or the largest, I think, in Mexico and in Latin America, kind of an institution that was founded in the late 1940s by Mexican commercial elites, basically to train young people to be able to participate in the world of business, be successful, help develop Mexican society, the Mexican economy, and so these friends of mine went to this private university, and at that university, something they would be taught with was a self-help book that at the time was very successful, a huge bestseller in Mexico by an author who's still around. His name is Carlos Cuauhtemoc Sanchez. And the book was titled in English, Youth in Sexual Ecstasy. So it's a book about young people's sexual behavior. This author, Carlos Cuauhtemoc Sanchez, writes on the one hand about business topics, business self-help, on the other hand about sex-related topics. So this book is written in the form of a novel. It tells the story of a university student who has a lot of fun, sleeps with a lot of girls. Because he sleeps with a lot of girls, has lots of bad things happen, which he's caused. He gets his girlfriend pregnant, and the girlfriend has a horrible bloody abortion. Then he gets a sexually transmitted disease until the doctor who treats his sexually transmitted disease, who's also a good Christian, challenges him on his behavior and converts him to some kind of fundamentalist Christianity, which makes him realize the value of sexual abstinence before marriage, the link between sex and having children, and so on and so forth. Yes, it sounds quite risible in the way in which I tell it, but at the time I remember my Mexican friends were really freaked out by this book, and I started to read it and I was really freaked out by it, even though I knew quite well what I was looking at there. So that made me realize for the first time the kind of power which popular psychological discourses, because this author mixes fundamentalist Christian with psychotherapeutic rhetoric, can have over people. Now, what's important in this context is that this man, Carlos Cuauhtemoc Sanchez, very distinctive way of inserting himself into public life. Again, not as a public intellectual, but as somebody who wants to sell you something very crudely put. Wants to sell you books via his own publishing house, wants to sell you self-help events. You can hire him still today as a public speaker, all kinds of other products which he sells. So there's a very specific commercially focused mode of insertion into public life, which I think in part has contributed to his success in Mexico and further afield. For example, his work, as I know, is also quite popular among Spanish-speaking people in the USA and elsewhere in the Americas. So what I've become very interested in my research is explaining the success of these self-help entrepreneurs, understanding their specific mode of operations, their specific mode of entering the public sphere, and their way of generating attention, generating interest, and for that matter, generating profits for themselves through the things which they do. And Carlos Cuauhtemoc Sanchez, my earliest example on that, actually I wrote my first ever journal article about him a long time ago now as well, is just one example. You could just as well look at Jon Kabat-Zinn, and Jon Kabat-Zinn has written very explicitly at one point that the way in which he has promoted mindfulness is about giving a particular group of practitioners a pathway into public life and a commercial pathway for making mindfulness prominent and widespread and widely accepted.
Right. And the article that really caught my attention was the article that just came out that you co-authored with Ashley Frawley, The title is, we'll have this on our show notes, of course, Mindfulness and the Psychological Imagination, published in the Sociology of Health and Illness. This article really does unpack just this whole idea of the self-help entrepreneur. And I think we're both on the same page because I'm a huge fan of C. Wright Mills as well, who wrote the classic book, The Sociological Imagination. So your article is sort of kind of orthogonal flip on the psychological imagination, which I completely agree with that direction of this article, and how you bring into view how mindfulness as a fad or as a movement, it employs a particular discourse which is very kind of counter to the sociological imagination. And so let's begin perhaps with two questions. And the first question is, can you help unpack or distinguish between these two forms of discursive imaginations, the sociological and the psychological? And what implications does that have for our social life? These two not dominant. The psychological imagination is the dominant discourse now.
Yes, so what inspired me to write about the psychological imagination is this statement by C. Wright Mills in the Sociological Imagination, now more than 60 years ago, that sociological way of thinking about human life is becoming, or was becoming at the time, according to Mills, in the USA, the dominant perspective, or at least very influential, very meaningful, perspective. And what Mills meant by this, of course, was an understanding of personal troubles of the individual life course in broader social and structural and historical context. The ability not only to look at oneself and one's own concerns, but to make sense of one's own concerns from a broader social and political perspective. So there's kind of, I guess, optimistic note in Mills's work, perhaps, in terms of the promotion of this kind of perspective. And that's also reflected in his career, because Mills was at least as much a public intellectual as he was somebody who wrote for academic audiences. So this ability of sociologists to reach out and promote a sociological understanding of human life, very influential in his work. On the other hand, then you have the psychological and imagination and self-help entrepreneurs, which in the 60 years since, I would agree with you, there have perhaps become the dominant mode of thinking about human life in many societies, and about engaging with general audiences about human life. And what the psychological imagination does is quite radically different. I've been thinking about it in terms of a kind of retreatism, a kind of retreat from public life, a kind of withdrawal in ethical and moral terms, and in terms of people's scope of looking at the world, engaging with the world, trying to understand the world into oneself, into the private sphere, to oneself and the people that most immediately surround us. So we look at personal troubles, to get back to Mills, strictly as personal troubles, and try and ask ourselves how we can address these personal troubles through specific techniques of self-care. And the kind of commodified version of mindfulness, which you've also very extensively analyzed, for example, in your Mindfulness, is one example of this, the kind of religiously infused account of sexuality, of which I gave an example before, is another example of this kind of retreatism. And what I've been wondering about, I've written about this a little bit in my 2016 book, whether this retreatism might be interpreted as a kind of response to living in a time of crisis, living in a time where the mechanism of politics, where the mechanism specifically of democratic politics may to many people not necessarily seem accessible or even intelligible anymore, and whether this is what prompts this kind of withdrawal into the private. So from that perspective, I think that the question of therapeutic politics, the way in which therapeutic cultures is linked to particular forms of political engagement or disengagement, is very important and very meaningful still. I recently submitted a paper to a journal, paper about therapeutic politics, and got a lot of very helpful peer review, but one critical comment has stuck with me. The peer reviewer argued at one point that in his or her view, the issue of therapeutic politics had been largely settled in the academic literature, that there isn't much more to say about this nexus between therapeutic culture and politics, that it had been established how therapeutic culture was depoliticizing, led to political disengagement, and so on and so forth. And I don't think that this is so at all. I think there's a lot more to be said about this subject matter, and I think that this is really quite crucial still.
But there's a lot you said, and we could go in many directions, and one of the things that just comes to mind immediately when you talked about Mills, and you mentioned that he was a public intellectual, and very different than a self-help entrepreneur, obviously. And it seems like that was a dying breed, or that for some reason, and I've always wondered this, why academics are so domesticated in terms of staying within the safe confines. I hate to use the word ivory tower because I think ivory towers are good in some ways because they allow us to have the freedom to think differently. But to restrict one's voice to a very sort of narrow, disciplinary, small audience of peer-reviewed academics in academic journals, I just don't understand that phenomena. And maybe this is another conversation, but maybe towards the end we could talk a bit about that, because one of the things that you bring up is just how the neoliberalization of the university has contributed to this trend, and that this idea of critical, socially engaged scholarship is something that we need to really start thinking seriously about. Is that something that you're passionate about or that you're thinking about?
Oh, yes, very much. I'm actually just doing a book about this together with my colleague Kristina Brunila at the University of Helsinki, Academic Capitalism and its effective dimension and the way in which academic capitalism is transforming modes of academic labor. So again, I'm going to sound terribly cynical here, but I do think it's actually an important point. I think that just many of the incentives to be a kind of public intellectual like Mills have vanished. And I think that to a large extent, universities around the world are disincentivizing scholars from such modes of public and engagement. So I was socialized into academia through the British academic system, which during my time in the UK changed quite radically and became, as academic systems in many other places, for example, here in East Asia, very narrowly driven by performance management techniques and a very narrow set of performance indicators, journal ranks, impact factors, age index scores, and so on. So what that does is that scholarship becomes evacuated of its intellectual content. Recently at a conference in Helsinki, actually, I took a photo of a street dog that I see walking around my university campus, put that onto a journal cover sheet, titled the Journal of Excellent Sociology, and claimed, put an impact factor of 25 on it, and claimed that if that image of the street dog really got published, everybody would be very happy about my great contribution to sociology. And I thought that this terrible act of cynicism would not go down so well. I thought that I might be challenged quite heavily on saying this so polemically. To my shock, everybody agreed with me, and this, I think, shows how far we've gone down the rabbit hole. And then, on the other hand, the second factor is clearly the casualization of academic labor. How scarce permanent, stable academic employment has become. So there is really very little scope for public engagement. And I think that opens pathways for other modes of public engagement, with which psychologists, for example, have been much more successful in developing and exploiting than sociologists have in this figure of the self-help entrepreneur.
Yeah. Well, let's get back to that article, because there's so much good stuff in it. And one of the things I think that you really illuminate is just how influential language and categories and labels are informing institutional interest and knowledge. And your work reminds me very much of Nicholas Rose's critical work on the sociology of knowledge and what he has termed as side disciplines. Basically how academic and expert knowledge is sort of intertwined or enmeshed with institutional and commercial interest. So in the article that you wrote on mindfulness, you point out that up until the 1960s, mindfulness never appeared in any outlets, really, the term, except in Buddhist publications on Buddhist philosophy, that it wasn't until the 1970s or so that we began seeing mindfulness appear outside of Buddhist thought in new models of psychotherapeutic practice. But it was really the work of two self-help entrepreneurs, Daniel Goleman and Jon Kabat-Zinn, that were instrumental in ushering mindfulness into popular psychology. And you point out, I think very astutely in your article, that Kabat-Zinn's Full Catastrophe Living book is a prime example of the self-help genre, how he uses the rhetoric or the language of the medical scientific language to bolster his credibility, his narrative authority. At the same time, and I think this goes to the core of your point about the self-help entrepreneur, at the same time you also found that Kabat-Zinn wasn't shy about promoting his commercial interest. Is that correct?
Yes, very much so. And to say something which I've said a few times before, slightly differently, I think that one of the reasons why Kabat-Zinn did this was in order to promote a certain kind of discourse, which he thought would be beneficial for stress reduction, anxiety relief, to treat a whole range of conditions. I think that people like Kabat-Zinn promote discourses like mindfulness. I do think it's done in good faith. I do think that commercial activity of self-help entrepreneurs such as that of Goleman, Kabat-Zinn, and so forth is to a large extent based on good faith in order to make clinical knowledge, therapeutic knowledge, which often is framed in very complicated language, accessible to broader audiences. But I also think that the cultural effects of inserting discourses, such as mindfulness, by way of a process of conceptual and linguistic simplification. The term mindfulness itself is a great simplification of a very complex set of discourses, is not necessarily at all beneficial to generating complex understandings of human life, complex understandings of the political implications of human life, and complex understandings of public ethics and the way in which we do engage and should engage with each other in public life. So in other words, what I would argue is that from the kind of simplification that mindfulness exemplifies, there's a direct connection to this sort of withdrawal or retreatism that I've tried to describe before, because mindfulness in its very simplified form just doesn't give us a conceptual vocabulary that's complex enough for us to make sense of what's really going on in social life around us, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I think that's a fair statement. But certainly he was one of the early self-help entrepreneurs in terms of having one of the earliest commercial websites selling his CDs as early as 1998. I think he even trademarked, got an official trademark for MBSR. But I think that's what your article really does a good job of, is highlighting just how this self-help entrepreneurship mobilizes academic knowledge and authority, not just for commercial gain, but this unique kind of strange kind of fusion, right? There's a way you put it, the scholar, the writer, and the business person all into one entity.
Yeah. And there's a big contradiction there, because you look at any of these texts, you look, for example, at anything non-academic published by Jon Kabat-Zinn, and there will be a big emphasis on his academic credentials and his academic success as a kind of marketing tool. So any Jon Kabat-Zinn product will show you, bluntly put, Jon Kabat-Zinn is a really important and really successful person who's got all these credentials that should make him, in your view, as a consumer, credible. But that, on the other hand, the most widespread, the most publicly accessible, the most commodified Jon Kabat-Zinn products don't give you the whole set of complex knowledge about mindfulness and where mindfulness comes from and what mindfulness really is and what mindfulness might actually mean. What it gives you is a kind of great simplification of the whole discourse. And that's a huge contradiction there.
Yeah, and I think connected to that is your observation, just how the mindfulness movement, it probably wasn't even a movement at this point, but it slowly began to expand its claims. I mean, it started out, fairly modest, in terms of doing research in the hospital setting, and wasn't really becoming, that pervasive, but, it was almost like there was this movement towards kind of a gradual expansion of its claims, its practical relevance into all these other domains, which really I think is then when it's that point when it really did become it became really mainstream, right? Is that something you noticed as well in your study?
Yeah. And this is something that brings me back to this contrast between the sociological and the psychological imagination. So look again at a classic public intellectual. Look, for example, back at C. Wright Mills's public commentary on the Cold War, or say at the revolution in Cuba, and the way in which he tried to engage with American audiences about these topics in the late 1950s, very early 1960s, and the way in which he was trying to communicate a set of fairly nuanced points in order to generate, well, likewise, a more nuanced understanding of Cold War politics among his audience, and then contrast this with the very broad claims that you find, for example, in Kabat-Zinn and among many other proponents of mindfulness about all the things that mindfulness can do for you. Mindfulness in very broad brush strokes. Mindfulness can relieve all sorts of mental and physical conditions, and you see there, again, a very stark contrast. And this very stark contrast, I would again explain this through the need for self-help entrepreneurs to insert them into public life in a primarily commercial manner, because if you want to sell somebody a product, instead of just speaking in public life in a more disinterested, interested way, then you need to be able to claim that your product is a great thing, does a lot of things, will bring you, in the case of, say, a self-help book, great success, or in the case of a mindfulness book, improvements for all sorts of problems and conditions that might afflict you. So these great claims to all the things that mindfulness can do go hand in hand with this great reduction in complexity that I've mentioned before. So we've got, I would say, a direct trajectory from the relatively early beginnings of Kabat-Zinn's work and the promotion of mindfulness in commercial terms among a broad audience to Mindfulness for Dummies, one of the more recent mindfulness self-help books.
Yeah, the threads all seem to be coming together because of the spreading of these new claims, kind of the expansion of all these domains requires this narrative authority that you talked about of having the scientific expertise and the academic credentials and the promotion of specific programs, and then the commercial gain, insertion in terms of commercial interest. And you make another point in the article that, in addition, you came up with another kind of construct, which you called the importance of conceptual entrepreneurs. And self-help entrepreneurs could still be the same person, right? Could they still be both?
Yes. Self-help entrepreneurs are also conceptual entrepreneurs, in that one of their tasks is, and again, mindfulness exemplifies this very well, to take a set of, again, often very complex and very disparate narratives, psychotherapeutic narratives, medical narratives, religious or spiritual narratives, and spin them together into something that can be easily packaged and marketed and sold. And I mention mindfulness because of the way in which this one word label really, to an extent, does injustice to a very complex set of philosophical discourses.
Yeah, and when I first saw this term, conceptual entrepreneur, it sounded a lot like the colloquial term, the sickening term, thought leader.
Yes.
You also make a really good point that mindfulness, these claims really function in a way to narrate cultural assumptions. And I think that's a really, really important point, that the success of the mindfulness movement and its popularity can only be partially attributed to its lucrativeness and its scientific rhetoric. There was something deeper going on. In other words, we can't just attribute its popularity to just, science says that mindfulness works and all that. But there were some underlying drivers, right, that it seems like mindfulness aligned with some deeper cultural outlooks. Can you elaborate a bit on that, or what you mean by that?
Yeah, I guess what I mean by this is something which we've already spoken about a little bit. You mentioned this earlier on in reference to the decline of religion and other frameworks that might give meaning to people in everyday life. So again, China serves as a good example. While I certainly question the moral panic that's existed here in China around a kind of moral crisis of Chinese society, it must be said that first the advent of communism in 1949, then very large scale and often very dramatic upheaval in Chinese society, for example, the times of the Cultural Revolution, and then the market capitalist makeover of Chinese society have evacuated it of major belief systems, religious belief systems, other traditional belief systems that previously might have given a structure of meaning to people in the way in which they conduct their everyday lives. And that's, I think, where popular psychology might come in and start to fill certain gaps. Likewise, I mentioned this Mexican self-help entrepreneur, Carlos Cuauhtemoc Sanchez, before. Sanchez became successful in the early 1990s in Mexico at a time when religion, traditional religion, Catholicism was still widely influential in Mexico, but alternative belief systems such as evangelical Christianity also had gained strong currency, and at the same time there was a broad process of secularization underway, and Mexican society was undergoing increasing social upheaval, the early beginnings of the drug war that's still underway in a society that's increasingly chaotic. So I think what popular psychology does, or can do at least in its most successful form, is address certain absence of meaning that people may encounter in their everyday lives by way of offering them easily digestible solutions and pathways to understanding what's going on. Those don't reach very deep. Self-help, as Paul Lichterman already argued long ago, is certainly a kind of thin culture. But I think precisely because it's thin, it's also so attractive at a time when broader, more profound systems of meaning that require deep engagement are not so easily available anymore. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it certainly makes sense. And this idea of the psychological imagination that we've been discussing, the tendency in terms of how it frames, individualizes basically social and political problems in many ways. But I think there's something even more troubling in the discourse that you also recognize. It's this idea that scientifically that we could discover these universal human truths and that they're trans-historical and trans-cultural. Is that something that you notice in the rhetoric and in the discourses?
Yes. This is, I guess, a point about which you have to be very cautious. This is something that came out particularly in the work that I've done with my colleague Dylan Carrigan in the Caribbean, looking at the colonial and post-colonial dimensions of a therapeutic culture, that on the one hand there is an effort in the promotion of therapeutic culture to universalize modes of addressing human well-being and human suffering, and for that matter, modes of social control and domination, but that on the other hand, these efforts can also be quite directly be bound up with what we've termed in the book the colonization of consciousness, ways of obscuring locally specific modes of social life, social interaction, as well as social problems and forms of human suffering.
And there may be many local variations on the actual content or the variegated nature of self-help techniques or whatever, but it sounds like underlying all that is these deeper universal sort of assumptions that, as you say, they sort of colonize and drive out or have kind of like a historical erasure of more indigenous or local traditions, right? Is that something that you discovered?
Yes, most certainly. And again, this has something to do with the commercial nature of popular psychology. For example, if I write a self-help book, I would want to sell it to a broad audience. If I want to sell it to a broad audience, it must be written in a way that doesn't speak to only a locally specific subset of people. So, for example, this Mexican self-help book that I mentioned before, Youth in Sexual Ecstasy, is really addressed to a very specific group of Hispanic Christian readers in Mexico, in the USA, in other parts of Latin America, but it never makes that point. It never states which society it is about, whether it's about Mexican society, American society, somewhere else. It articulates its claims in a very universalistic kind of way, talking about medicine, talking about religious values, and so on.
Maybe that's a good way to end. And I really appreciate you coming on the podcast and all the way from Shanghai. It's the first time I interviewed someone from Shanghai. So thank you, Daniel. It was a great conversation. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope you can give us a review if you get a chance on iTunes or any of the other podcast platforms that you may be listening to. You can always look at the show notes, of course, by going to our website, mindfulcranks.com, our Facebook page, Twitter page, and we're planning soon to start a Patreon page to open it up for those of you that might want to help contribute a few bucks a month to help cover some of the cost of our production. So again, thank you for listening. We have upgraded our microphone and other software to improve the audio quality, and I hope you notice it and are enjoying these last couple of episodes. So stay tuned, and again, thank you so much for listening.